I call the member for Wright.
And I thank you, Mr Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission Bill 2012 and the Australian Charities Non-for-Profits Commission Consequential and Transition Bill of 2012. And Mr Speaker, in my opening remarks, it would be remiss of me not to add some advice to our previous speaker with reference to the intent of this bill. And whilst at face value in reading the preamble to the bill seeks to reduce red tape for our non-for-profits and charity sector. The Coalition shares my great concern that this is just not achievable, given the evidence that we have received at the Economics Committee hearings. I represent the electorate of Wright, and earlier in my term we had a massive loss of lives as a result of flooding, and I am the first-hand recipient of the generosities of charities from right across Australia who come to my electorate's aid. And so it's only forthright and it's only fair that I stand and try and return the compliment to those agencies who, under this bill, will be burdened with extra regulatory requirements, and I will go on and extrapolate the evidence and read direct from Hansard the evidence that was provided to the committee and leave the government in no doubt that the transition or the tack that they are making on this legislation will not reach its objectives. And for that reason, the Coalition cannot support this bill. The not-for-profit sector plays a major role in Australian society. It comprises of 600,000 entities that provide services in education, sport, welfare, art, religion, culture and community well-being. By definition, the sector also engages heavily with volunteers, and much of its contributions to Australia's society is outside the dollar economy, and is estimated of volunteers' time donated to this nation to be in excess of around $14.6 billion, a colossal effort by those who give their time freely. The bill seeks to provide the establishment of a new statutory office, the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission, which would be the Commonwealth regulator for the non-for-profit sector. The bill provides the ACNC Commissioner with a range of enforcement powers. These powers are modelled on those given to other Commonwealth regulators such as ASIC, APRA and the ACCC. These bills provide the ACNC with the authority to, no less, issue warnings of notice, issue directives, enter into enforceable undertakings, apply to the courts for injunctions on charities, no less than suspend or remove responsible entities, and appoint acting responsible entities. So these are enormous powers under this bill given to this body. The bill specifies the conditions that must be satisfied before the ACNC Commissioner and can be enforced powers, the scope and range of the ACNC's enforcement powers and the associated penalties for contravening enforcement powers issued by the ACNC Commissioner. The ACNC Commissioner would also be able to exercise enforcement powers only over registered entities. The ACNC Commissioner may generally only use enforcement powers against federally regulated entities. However, the ACNC Commissioner may revoke registration of any registered entity. The ACNC Commissioner enforcement powers in relation to external conduct standards applies to all registered entities. Only the Coalition plan will help the sector. We support a much smaller commission to focus on innovation, education and advocacy. Our approach is to cut red tape, genuinely cut red tape, such as in our proposal with the family services area, where contracting reforms will make it easier for agencies and civil society. The intention of this bill, we're told, is to reduce red tape, which provides that the ACNC Commissioner will cooperate with other government agencies to oversee and simplify and streamline regulatory framework for non-for-profit entities. So basically, this bill tells us that the organisation is, and when challenged, the ACNC said, well, our intention of reducing the red tape is to go to the states and have them reduce their regulatory burden on the sector. Whilst doing that, creating another level of bureaucracy over the top of an already burden-laden compliance sector. The bill should include a clear the bill should include a clear obligation on the government and its agencies to reduce the unnecessary duplicate and burdensome administrative reporting and compliance obligation on not-for-profits. Evidence provided to the Economics by the Economic Committee at the inquiry raised serious concerns by stakeholders that a lack of confidence exists that this bill reached its objectives of reducing red tape. Our previous speaker indicated that this had wide-ranging support across the sector. Well, that's just not true, Mr. Speaker. There are many players in the sector who oppose this bill, and it is my intention tonight to highlight their concerns. ACOS, an organisation that was mentioned by the previous speaker with underlying support. ACOS was concerned that the benefits from minimalising procedural requirements and duplication or cooperation between the Commission and other government agencies do not provide adequate assurance that the sector will benefit from these reforms. They went on to say, throughout the evolution of this reform, the sector has been assured of principles such as light touch regulation and the commitment to the reduced duplication of reporting requirements and enhance the value of the reporting that undertaken in the terms of information for and about the sector. Yet these principles are not evident in the ACNC bill. It is important that the legislation includes an explicit objective of reducing red tape. First hand, ACOS have serious concerns about this bill. So it is unfair to say that the sector supports this. The Coalition acknowledges the wishes of the non-for-profit sector and that the reduction of red tape should be made an explicit objective of the bill and agrees this should occur, but we hold great concerns that these objectives will not be met. Mr Daniels, the Executive Director of the Independent Schools Council of Australia, said in his evidence at the Economics Inquiry, however, his quote was, "However, we say that some of the proposals in this legislation are simply another layer of legislation and that reporting and accountability would add to the burden." Hardly the comments of someone who was supportive of this bill, I would suggest. I questioned Mr Daniels, and I questioned him and said, one of the cornerstones of this proposed bill is that it will reduce compliance and red tape. Do you have an indicative date or an indicative opinion from the states, being the state governments, as to whether or not they are moving towards reducing their compliance requirements? Mr Daniels' response to me from Hansard was, "I have been with this organisation for more than a decade and I've seen no reductions whatsoever in reporting requirements. In fact, an increase in reporting requirements. There has been no discussion whatsoever with the states or indeed with the Commonwealth Department that I'm aware of that has involved the independent sector on any reduction in reporting requirements. The only discussion that I've had with the Commonwealth, apart from the ACNC briefings we had received, is a less than perfect understanding of what is intended by the Commission." Again, so there's been no discussion whatsoever of any reduction of any proposal to reduce reporting. Perplexed by someone who was supposedly a supporter of this bill, I went on and asked him, would it be a concern of your organisation that if you were represented here today, given that evidence that we heard earlier was clearly underpinned and motivated by the fact that there was going to be a reduction in red tape in order to streamline funding and provide long-term stability to the sector, that the fundamental piece of this building block was not going to be there or is not evident before the legislation is put before the House? Does this raise a concern with you? Mr Daniels' comment was, "It's a concern, but it's just another added complexity that each individual school would have to deal with. It's likely to add a layer of reporting and accountability that is not there." When the government says they're going to put a reporting mechanism in place to reduce compliance, and the expectation is that the compliance reductions will come from the states, can you imagine the states' health departments, for example, reducing their level of compliance on their hospitals that would fall under this portfolio or this bill? Would you suggest that the schools, the state education departments would reduce their levels of compliance because now there was another layer of bureaucracy in Canberra? I suggest not. The states have not agreed to hand over any of their powers with respect to charities and non-for-profits to Commonwealths, such as the powers with respect to incorporated associations, fundraising, etc. So the new regulator will be an additional layer of red tape and thus not achieve its primary objective in reducing regulation. We, the Coalition, believe the government should get out of the way of the civil society and let them do what they do best, help people and help the community. Labor is creating a roadblock for the operation of charities and the not-for-profit sector and for people's involvement in civil society. The bill provides a tiered system of registration based on revenue threshold and has been done in order to minimise the compliance burden placed on registered entities. Reporting requirements under the bill are proportional to the size of the registered entity based on revenue thresholds. And there are 3 tiers. Small registered entities is an entity with an annual revenue of less than $250,000. A medium entity is considered under $1 million, and a large entity is over $1 million or more. Revenue is calculated in accordance with the relevant accounting standard issued by the Australian Accounting Standards Board. During the inquiry, the committee received evidence that the proposed thresholds were too low. It is the submission from the Anglican Church Diocese of Sydney where it expressed explicit concern that the revenue thresholds used to determine whether a registered entity is small, medium or large remains, quote this, unhelpfully low. Again, far from the support that the Labor government's voice that there is unqualified support for this submission. The submissions also noted that the thresholds currently proposed are based on those used by the states and territories under Incorporations Association legislation and also under the Corporations Act for companies limited by guarantee. He went on to say that we understand that it's convenient for these thresholds to be retained, particularly to ensure that there are minimum impediments for state and territory agencies agreeing to report the ACNC as a one-stop shop. However, beyond convenience, there is no obvious basis as to why these thresholds should be adopted for the whole of the sector. In our view, good reasons to doubt the suitability of thresholds for the whole sector under the ACNC bill. In hearing this evidence, we have the ACNC now aligning itself to the very organisations that they claim that they're going to reduce the thresholds of. This is not what you perceive to be a positive step in removing itself from state legislation. Instead, we see Labor putting up policy which supports the parasitic behaviour of growing bureaucracy just to justify its own existence. In addition, the Independent Schools Council of Australia also protested against the probable impact of the threshold on the independent school sector. Most schools would qualify as a large entity with the consequent reporting burden that applied to that tier. I'd like to now take you to the director's liability and the impact of those volunteers that give many hours around the nation. As a provision of the bill, it deals with obligations, liabilities and offences under the Act and provides that if an entity is subject to an obligation or liability or commits an offence, certain entities that are responsible for managing the primary entity may also be subject to the obligation or liability or commit the offences in specific situations. The effect the bill imposes personal liability on directors of body corporate in certain circumstances. With reference to the penalties and offences of the bill, it establishes a regime of administrative penalties. These can be imposed by Commonwealth agencies without the need for court action. Quite perplexing. However, appropriate sanctions are required for a deterrent effect and protect those who seek to cooperate with the Commissioner. We also received evidence before the committee that the Australian Institute of Company Directors questioned the value of placing liabilities on people who are essentially volunteers working for the community. Comments like, "It concerns me massively that we might be the first country in the world to make being a non-for-profit as a director more onerous than being a for-profit." That's what this bill does. In conclusion, this bill is Labor to its bootlaces. This bill presented to the House with the intention of reducing red tape. I have provided evidence from the sector which shares my concern that you cannot reduce red tape by creating another level of bureaucracy. The bill provides unnecessary penalties on volunteer organisations who are the backbone of our nation, and it's unfair to penalise and inflict on them that would be a greater penalty than that under the Corporations Act. Again, My heart goes out to every single volunteer that assisted me and the electorate of Wright during those terrible flood times. And again, it is my civic duty and my responsibility in this House to try and reduce the burdens on non-for-profits by opposing this bill.